Hello, everybody. This is Webb Wilder, the last of the full-grown men, and you're listening to Icon Fetch.
Welcome to Icon Fetch. I am Tony Peters. Now, there have been other books written about Warren Zevon, but author James Campion takes a novel approach with his new book. Accidentally Like a Martyr, The Tortured Art of Warren Zevon, just out from Backbeat Books, attempts to explore Zevon's life through a closer examination of his songs, many of them rather autobiographical. And through many new interviews with friends, family, and colleagues, we get a first-hand account of one of the most enigmatic singers of all time. And to talk about it, we welcome in author James Campion. James, how are you, man?
I'm very well, Tony. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, no, so you have been a lifelong Warren Zevon fan. So, sort of watching his career as a fan, how did this idea of actually doing a book on one of your idols come about?
Well, as I've been telling everybody doing this book tour, and it's been fantastic meeting all the Zevon fans. It's really shocking. Sometimes you sit, for 2.5 years, as I did with this book, and you start to realize, wow, there are a lot of Warren Zevon fans out there. They're coming out of the woodwork for my book appearances, which have been great, and the interviews. And what I've been basically telling everyone, and I'll tell you and your audience, is that, I looked around just a few years ago, and I realized Crystal Zevon, who I interviewed for my book, his ex-wife had written a oral biography called I'll Sleep When I'm Dead right after he passed in 2003, put together a series of interviews, and George Plaskides, who I became very good friends with, a professor at Auburn University, had done a straight biography of him a few years after that. But for the most part, nobody has ever delved into the songs, into the things that make us Zevonites, as I like to call them.
Right.
Love him so much. The lyrics, the titles, the subject matter, which is very antithetical to a lot of what was going on in California in the late 60s, 70s, and even beyond. So I thought this is a book that needed to be written, and I think that anybody who sits down to do any piece of craft or art looks around and says, I think no one's ever really tackled this. So it really came down to that, Tony.
Nice. And that's always, when you're writing a book, you need to find sort of a hole, a void, or something like that, and sort of fill it. So you're putting this book together, and you decide, okay, I'm going to look at his songs. Now, as an avid fan, was that an easy process to kind of, did you start with a much, much larger list of songs that you want to analyze kind of thing?
No, actually, I did this as a fun project for me. My previous book for Backbeat Books, my publisher was shouted out loud the story of Kiss's Destroyer and the Making of an American Icon. I spent about 3 years plus on that book. It's much larger piece of rock history of the 70s. So it was a big undertaking. It took about a year for that book to come out, and I wanted to do something new and something different and something more personal. And I took a song that I consider my favorite of Warren's canon, called Desperados Under the Eaves, which is the last song on his first Asylum record that was produced by Jackson Browne and so many famous people on it. And I just spent a week just writing about it, just writing about that song. And I was inspired by Greil Marcus's book, the great rock critic and author, his book on Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, called Like a Rolling Stone, Bob Dylan at the Crossroads, which I had read about a week or so earlier on a plane to Nashville. It got detoured into Chicago, so it was like about a 3-hour flight. But the entire book, I could not put it down, was about one song. But I don't think I could do an entire book, but let me sit down. This song always spoke to me. It always had some great mystery to it. It's a great short story with arcs. It's very poetic, yet it does have a prose aspect that attracted me as a writer. So I sat down and I wrote that. I sent that to my editor. I said, what do you think? And she said, well, what do you think you want to do? And I said, let me tackle another song, and then another song, and then it started to become a book. And it didn't really occur to me to do it chronologically until I realized you kind of can tell this guy's story, his life story. So it's not a straight biography, my book, but you could tell that story through the way he wrote. Some of it autobiographical, but also some of it just touchstones and little snippets of the way his life was and the life of many rock stars or other singer-songwriters during the period in which he wrote the songs. And that was a lot of fun for me.
Sure, absolutely. Now, so you've got these essays, but the thing that really fleshes out your book is you've got all these interviews that you've done, Jackson Browne, J.D. Souther, you've got Crystal Zevon, Warren's ex-wife, all this sort of stuff. How, as, Those are pretty heavy hitters there. Was there sort of one interview that sort of opened you up to other interviews kind of thing? That sometimes that sort of happens?
Well, the first person I interviewed was George Gruhl, a very close friend of Warren's. In fact, he considered him his best friend. If you listen to his live album, Stand in the Fire, Warren says, "Hey, I want to welcome up George Gruhl during Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me, my best friend and my road manager." He called him his aide-de-camp in classic Warren fashion. I got a hold of George, the first guy, and he introduced me to a lot of people, but he also told me some great inside stories about Warren on the road, his alcoholism, his idiosyncrasies, which later on became his OCD, and all the different aspects of Warren's life creatively and personally. And that wound me through all the people you mentioned, including Waddy Wachtel, co-producer of Excitable Boy, who's now the band leader for Stevie Nicks. Waddy, a great guy. He had some really nice things to say about the book. He sent me an email just a couple of days ago. Jorge Calderon, who was really probably, I would say arguably, Warren's best friend, his longest-running friend, wrote about 16 songs with him over a 30-year period, 25-year period, and was with him at the end when he did his brilliant The Wind album when he was dying and writing about dying. That was a fantastic interview. I know I'm going to leave people out. So much great insights from different people who really knew Warren well, but different aspects of him. To listen to his daughter Ariel talk about his relationships to women, his relationships to his children, his, again, idiosyncrasies, his personalities that would change sometimes. He was very mercurial as a person. He would be different in front of one person. I had one interview tell me, well, he was this way. Someone would refute that. So it's a fascinating story about a person who was constantly into his art. I quote this a lot when I've been doing these interviews. It's an old quote, obviously, from Oscar Wilde, who said, "I save my art for my life, but my craft, my work, is where it comes out." And Crystal said something to me that really informed the essays as I went along, and she said, if you want to know about Warren, you have to realize he's the artist first. And if you want to know about these songs, if you want to know about him, the man, they're all right there in this music, which, really did inform and inspire me as I worked on it.
Interesting. Now, we're all fans of certain artists, but when you start sort of delving into their personal life, did your opinion change of your idol as you're talking to his ex-wife and his kids and all these other people? How did that sort of develop as you're doing these interviews?
That's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer. I know George Plaskides, like I said, who wrote the biography, called me up one night, and he's like, "Do you hate him yet?"
All right.
One of the things, and this is true, and all great writers I respect came to Warren. He was friends with Stephen King, Hunter S. Thompson, Carl Hiaasen, Dave Barry, Judd Apatow, guys who made their bones putting down stories, telling stories, whether they be fiction or nonfiction. Mitch Albom, who was a sports writer, all came to Warren. They loved the short story aspect of his writing. They loved his mercurial personality. And they all have different things and came away in different ways, different opinions of him. So I think as a writer, you see the flaws, and they're expressed beautifully in these songs. I'm doing a podcast currently with Adam Duritz of Counting Crows. They're on tour doing their 25th anniversary tour. They're fantastic. I love them. It's called Underwater Sunshine. And
nice.
When I was working on a book with Adam, which is going to be my next project, and before we started doing the podcast, we talked about Warren because he said he loved him, when he was younger and growing up, and it informed his songwriting. And he said, the great thing about Warren, he goes, I try to put it in Counting Crows songs, is when you get a good flaw, when you get a good, raw confessional and you put it down. Because a lot of people are afraid to do that. Even me sometimes. Now, I've tried to write fiction and be very confessional. But to write about your flaws, the things that really are so terrible about you, that maybe repulsive to some other people, your personality, where you go, the kind of people you hang out with, the kind of activities that you participate in. Those are the kind of things that draw you as a writer to those kind of characters. Warren was a difficult and a very, again, mercurial personality. He had a conflicted heart and soul, as Ariel told me. And I believe it's in the songs, and I believe that was what the driving thing was. So I think if there were times I was a little wincing at some of the personality traits that Warren had, some of the activities, as I said, that he partook in. It was a different time period, certainly. But it's funny, he was very redemptive. His career was redemptive, his personality was redemptive, and all the people had a true love when they told me about him. And when we talked about him dying in 2002 into 2003, they were very emotional about how they had gone through these depths with him and came back, and how they were so proud of him and so honored to be in his presence during that period. So I think it's twofold. My editor, Bernadette, said to me, you walked a real tightrope with this book, and I think that that's the best way to put it.
Sure. Well, yeah, absolutely. Now, it's interesting. You talk to family members and you start to understand there's perhaps a reason why Warren was this type of person, and you talk about his parents. And you talk about, like, their relationship and this sort of key moment where his dad brings home this piano and his mom doesn't want it, and he hurls a knife at her. I mean, like, how much? This is the stuff of movies here,
Yeah. And first of all, thank you for reading the book. Sometimes you go on these interviews and people don't know.
Right.
They just ask you general. That's a very what you bring up, Tony, is a very seminal part of the artist. As a writer, you always try to figure out origins. And I don't want to be a junior psychologist here, but I mean, if you're raised by a Jewish gangster and a Mormon, and
right.
and you get the one instrument that defines you as a human being and as an artist, the piano, Chickering piano, on Christmas Eve of 1956, the year that Elvis Presley changes the planet by going and shaking his ass on the Ed Sullivan Show, and rock and roll becomes the art form for an entire generation and many generations to come. And this conflict happens between the gambler father, who wants to give his son this piano that he wins on this gambling bender, and the Mormon mother who's like, get that ill-gotten gains out of my home.
Right.
And there's Warren seeing this, and then Warren embraces the piano, and he conquers it, and he becomes a great songwriter on that instrument. And it's all there in the stories. But, yeah, you bring up really the seminal moment. And that story comes from Crystal's book and what Crystal told me when she couched it for me. And I thought it was very important to be in one of the essays that really tell you where this guy came from and where the songs come from. And as an addendum to that, if I could say, Warren said something very smart that I quote in all these interviews, and that is, he always said, why should I write the songs everybody writes? You could write a novel or make a film or a play about anything. But it seems like in the rock and roll idiom and the folk idiom, it has to be specific subject matter. So when he writes Excitable Boy, Werewolves of London, Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner, Accidentally Like a Martyr, The French Inhaler, Desperados Under the Eaves, these are short stories about damaged people who are trying to find connections and in specific places. And he was inspired by the noir writers like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and their ilk. And he wanted to write those songs. And that's what separates him from all the songwriters of his era, or really any era. And it's why I really was pained to write this book and do it in essay form so I can give light and give proper honor and tribute to those songs.
And what's interesting, Warren kind of has a chance meeting with Jackson Browne, whose career is also kind of on the rise. Do you think that was one of those pivotal moments that set him on that path, or do you think Warren was the kind of talent that eventually somebody else would have discovered him, kind of thing?
Another great question. Jackson Browne absolutely made Warren Zevon known. I mean, Jackson was his greatest, fan, and also put him. I mean, he went to Geffen. He went to Geffen Records, and he talked to David Geffen, and he begged him. And finally, Geffen said, "All right, I'll let you record him." People around L.A. knew about Warren. He had written songs for the Turtles. He had gotten a song on the Midnight Cowboy soundtrack, which won Best Picture in 1969. He was the Everly Brothers band leader. So he was known as a very solid songwriter and a professional around L.A. But Jackson Browne went to the Byrds, he went to the Eagles. He couldn't get anybody to record these songs because, like I said, they're very personal, they're very odd. They're not the normal fare, especially for the 70s in California at that time that was embracing that Bakersfield sort of country rock, laid-back sandals, jeans, touchy-feely stuff. But Jackson, who also wrote songs like that, quite frankly, but he saw something in Warren, and I think the short answer to that is I don't believe he would have eventually got there.
Okay.
I think that Warren, because Warren had gone to Spain, he kind of gave up on it all and married Crystal, and in 1974 went out to this little town in Spain called Stitches, which is just outside of Barcelona, and he was playing Irish folk songs in this little bar, and he was perfectly happy. Crystal said every night we'd say, we love this, they were going to have babies and just do that. And Jackson kept sending these notes to him. You got to come back here. These songs are too good. We have to record them. And he did, and then, of course, the rest is history.
Right. And he gets signed to Asylum Records. The first album, Warren Zevon, comes out, and it's critically acclaimed. But Warren was on this label with all these other, like, sort of stellar, the Eagles and Linda Ronstadt and Jackson Browne, and, the list goes on and on. But Warren's music, it wasn't quite sort of able to sort of pigeonhole kind of stuff. Did you get the idea that his relationship with Asylum Records was sort of contentious all along kind of thing?
They were, Geffen told Jackson, you were right about this guy, because the glowing reviews, and of course Linda Ronstadt, who would later record Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me, but right around that time put out a record called Hasten Down the Wind and recorded that song, which is also on that first record, and made it a hit and, blew up. And then, Warren was sort of the darling of the critics. And then 2 years later comes out with Excitable Boy, Werewolves of London is a quirky but big hit. And, he finally makes it. But, of course, without delving too deeply into it, the alcoholism, his attitude towards fame, his love of classical music and wanting to go into that direction, constantly this battle internally with himself about what am I doing? Should I be doing more? Really could be, as using your word, contentious with Asylum. But I think they respected and loved Warren. This was a different time when record companies would allow you to kind of build your career and build your brand. And that's why, Geffen called it Asylum Records. He wanted to make it an asylum for artists. And Jackson Browne is there, and Linda Ronstadt has mentioned, the Eagles, and of course, David loved Joni Mitchell and really nurtured her career. So these are not huge commercial artists in the early 70s, but they would all go on to be significant artists, and in the case of the Eagles, and Linda Ronstadt, be commercial artists. But I think that first record did make David Geffen and Asylum very, very happy that they had somebody with some real grit and some real density to the songwriting to sort of balance what was going on with the rest of their group.
What's interesting, you mentioned that nobody wanted to record Warren's songs until Linda Ronstadt. And what's interesting is I think Linda Ronstadt's, quite possibly, one of the most underrated artists of all time, because she put out an autobiography where she was, pretty much condemned her whole work from the 70s, which I think is ridiculous. So as an observer, I think she was a great interpreter. And I think that definitely shows in what she did with, she did Carmelita, she did, Hasten Down the Wind. She did a bunch of Zevon songs over the years. She was able to kind of breathe her own life into it. These were not carbon copies kind of thing. Right,
and J.D. Souther, her lover at the time and a great songwriter, she recorded many of J.D.'s songs, and he wrote songs for the Eagles and many other artists, and excellent solo artist in his own right, told me that when he was with Linda and she heard the Warren songs, and Linda, famously said, she thought he was a psychopath, Warren, when she first met him.
Right.
But he said that she understood implicitly how these songs would work for a female artist. And I think she takes something like Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me, and she almost makes it a female treatise, and or like a feminine treatise, I should say. And she really did get inside the songwriters, whether it was the Rolling Stones or Buddy Holly or all the songs she did in the 70s. And I agree, Tony, 100% with that. I just sent a book to Linda, and in the inscription I wrote, I was a huge fan of you in the 70s. Your voice, the magnificence of this voice, introduced me to so many great artists. And for her, and I didn't read her autobiography, but for her to dismiss that is really dismissing a whole generation of us who really grew up loving her voice and loving her combination of country music, rock music, balladries, and how she presented those songs to us. And she was great. I consider her the female Sinatra or Elvis Presley. She could take a song and own it the way Ella Fitzgerald would, or the way that Aretha Franklin would. And I think that is very underrated, and I agree with you 100%, Tony. And the fact that she, along with Jackson, really put Warren Zevon on the map, for someone who spent 2.5 years writing about Warren's songs and how deep and dark they could be, it really warms my heart. And listen, the first time I heard Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me, I heard Linda sing it.
Right.
So.
Yep. Me too. Me too. Yeah, absolutely. So, Excitable Boy, his album, the second album for Asylum, becomes a big hit, and you have this great story. I mean, I didn't know the whole depth that, Phil Everly was sort of involved with, kind of spurring Warren on to write this goofy Werewolves of London song, and it's just fascinating. You talk about his Crystal Zevon sort of just jotting this stuff down while Warren and Waddy are just spouting off these ridiculous lines of this song, and then they get up the next morning and they don't even realize that they wrote the song. They don't even remember it,
And the irony of that is one of the reasons why the subtitle of the book is The Tortured Art of Warren Zevon. And I swear to you, and I've said this to other people, it never occurred to me until I started going on a press junket for this and, doing book appearances, that people have brought this back up to me. It never occurred to me that I was using the old trope, tortured artist. And certainly Warren was that. And Backbeat Books was a little, I can't say put off, but they were like, do we really need to use the word tortured? But when I started doing these interviews with friends and colleagues, they were like, yes, you must use that. He was. And one of the reasons I brought it up in the first place is Warren would talk about this all the time. Songs did not come easily to Warren. He could work out a song for a year, I was told. He could work on a line or two. He gave interviews with Songwriter Magazine in the early 80s and Rolling Stone, and also people told me he would paint over a line or a stanza for weeks. So these songs were kind of tortured. But isn't it ironic? His biggest hit, Werewolves of London, is written in about 8 minutes. While they were drinking and smoking and doing the things they were doing, it was Waddy Wachtel and Leroy Marinell and Warren just pounding away on piano and guitar and singing out, woo, and all of a sudden, this thing comes out, and who the hell's going to remember that, right? And thank goodness for Crystal. She was jotting it all down in this notebook, and you're right, the next day, he meets, Jackson. He's recording the first album, and she says, tell him about this new song, the werewolf song. And he's like, what? Oh, yeah. And you mentioned Phil Everly. Phil Everly, hanging out with Warren a couple of days before that, or weeks maybe, says to him, you should write a dance craze called The Werewolf of London. I love that,
Right,
and
right.
that's the other thing that Jorge told me, Jorge Calderon. He's like, Warren never let up on a great title. A Splendid Isolation, Seminole Bingo, Porcelain Monkey, A Sentimental Hygiene.
Right, these are great titles, yes.
I mean, there's a movie called Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead that has nothing to do with the Warren Zevon song. Guy just loved it and called the movie that.
Right. Yeah. Those are great titles. And it's interesting. You talk about a lot of artists, their big song, especially if it's kind of a novelty sort of song, they run from it and they go, oh, God, I got to play this again. It was interesting. You had quotes over the years from several different points where he didn't feel that way at all.
No. Jordan, and I want to thank Jordan Zevon, his son, who gave me access to all of his lyrics. I think I quote over 42 songs in the book, and the Springsteen people for allowing me to print theirs, and all the guys that Warren worked with, whether it be Larry Klein or Paul Muldoon or the list is so long, Carl Hyacin. They all were so sweet in allowing me to print the lyrics and gratis. Just go ahead and do it. We love Warren. Jordan said that my dad was constantly trying to find new ways to express himself and never repeat himself and keep doing something fresh. But he considered his audience his patrons. I got to go out and I got to go take care of the patrons. They're the ones keeping me up here. And he often said, I would never, ever, can you imagine? He said it about other artists. I can't believe someone would have a hit. People would pay money and get in their cars or get on mass transit and go all the way to see you, on a weeknight. And then you tell them, nah, I'm too good to play my hit. It drove him nuts. So he considered himself a professional in that way from a young man all the way through his life. And he never, ever failed to play Werewolves of London or Excitable Boy or Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me in these sets. And in the 90s and the early aughts, when I would go see him playing just by himself in these small clubs or bars, he always played those songs with great aplomb. And I write about it in the essay for Muhammad's Radio about his live performances. Warren was an unblinking artist. I say that several times in the book. He would never avoid the subjects of his songs, and I always felt when I saw him play live that as if he was writing the song right before you or he was playing it for the first time. That's the exuberance he put into it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he never exhaled and said, oh, here we go, Werewolves of London, I'll give it to you.
Right.
No, he played it with the same aplomb he did in 1974 when he wrote it, and I love that about it.
Yeah, that's definitely saying a lot. And, towards the end of Warren's life, and, a lot of times we just hear, Tom Petty died. You know what I mean? It's like, for Warren, it was... He found out he had cancer, and he was, and very few people kind of have this opportunity to sort of take a victory lap, if you will. I mean, that's not quite the right word, but you were able to kind of celebrate Warren, the artist, while he was still alive in that last album. That was really kind of, I guess in a way, you wouldn't expect it any other way from a guy like Warren.
Yeah, I write about it in the essay for The Wind. I dedicate 3 essays to albums that I feel was seminal. We've talked about it here. Excitable Boy, because it made him famous, hugely famous, for a short state. Sentimental Hygiene, because it saved his life. And The Wind, because it was the end of his life. And I think it's really just a heartwarming story about Warren, just the last couple of albums he did for Artemis Records. And I interviewed Danny Goldberg, who worked with Nirvana and many other artists, the Beastie Boys, who really, again, saved Warren, brought him in. And the last couple of albums, Warren recorded in his home because he just didn't have the budget. Couldn't hire the musicians, or, he's playing these clubs and cars and riding around the country like he did when he was a young man. And then he finds out he's dying, and now everybody's coming to play with him. Tom Petty, you mentioned. Bruce Springsteen breaks from his tour and cancels his Christmas vacation to come and play with Warren. Ry Cooder, who Warren always wanted to play with, and the usual suspects, Don Henley and Jackson Browne, they all come to Billy Bob Thornton, who had just signed a book and sent off to a good friend of Warren's and a neighbor for a short time when they lived in this apartment in L.A. when Billy Bob didn't have really anything. They all came to celebrate the final months of Warren's life, and it comes through in that music, and it's just so... I think a victory lap is kind of a good way to put it. I don't think you were being pithy when you were saying that. I think it was a way, and Jordan said it was a way for him to at least, he got more out of those guys coming and paying tribute to him than he ever would have for winning Grammys posthumously, which he did after he passed away. And those songs, the honesty of the songs, the pathos of the songs, it's just magnificent. And to have the honor to be able to write that stuff and write about it, from a personal standpoint, because my beloved mother-in-law, Mary Lou Moore, died of cancer when I was writing that essay, and I dedicate the book to her, and she was a great artist in her own right. And to be able to write, it's a great honor, and it's a great gift as a writer to be able to mine and dive into that and express that and share that with people so they know, and let the people who worked on that record with him let you know what it was like to do it. And it's a brave thing and a wonderful thing, and I guess it's a nice little neat way to wrap up the Warren Zevon story.
Now, you've written a book about Kiss, and there's certainly a lot of mystique with those guys, and you wrote a book about Warren Zevon, a lot of mystique about that artist as well. And you mentioned your next sort of project is going to be Counting Crows, is that right?
Yeah, I'm working on a book with Adam Duritz. Adam and I became close in the late aughts, 2008. I wrote a piece about the record Saturday Nights and Sunday Mornings. He and I were corresponding for a while. Prior to that, I had sent him my first published book in 1996, and I've always been a big fan of his lyrics and the mystical aspect of them, the myths that he creates using cities and women's names and personal expressions. And as he said to me over the months we were working on the book, this is true of almost all artists, but it's especially true of Adam. He said, all the songs are me, man. The characters are me. The places are me. This is what I was going through at the time, and I'm sharing it with you. And not all of it's good. Some of it is.
Well, cool. Well, hey, James, it's been good talking to you. The new book from James Campion is Accidentally Like a Martyr, The Tortured Art of Warren Zevon, and we wish you good luck on it, man.
Thank you so much. You can get it anywhere. If you want a signed copy, I'm sending it out free shipping if you live in the continental USA. Just go to jamescampion.com. There's a little order button there. We take PayPal, credit cards, the whole 9 yards, and I'll sign a book to you. That's been the most fun, if I can finish with that, Tony, is that the fans have been saying, can you write, I'll sleep when I'm dead, or some great line from Warren in there. And to be able to connect with them, they're taking photographs of the signature and putting it online on Facebook. That's been great, connecting with Zevon fans and sharing this love we have of this songwriter I think that should be bigger, should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and I'm joining David Letterman and Eddie Vedder and Bruce Springsteen trying to get this guy through the finish line. That's where he belongs, and I hope my book is a small, small sliver of that crusade to get him to more listeners, to another generation. So, yeah, contact me through there. Let me know you guys how you like the book. And, Tony, thank you for a few minutes and allowing me to talk about Warren in the book. I really appreciate the time.
You got it, man. You got it.
You've been listening to Icon Fetch with Tony Peters. Want more great interviews? Head on over to iconfetch.com. There you'll find every interview we've ever done, plus CD reviews, This Day in Music, and a random album of the day. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. Who's Tony going to interview next? It could be you. Send us what you've got to Tony Peters, Icon Fetch, P.O. Box 292134, Dayton, Ohio, zip code 45429, or email Tony, host@iconfetch.com. Until next time, this is Joe Kelly. Have a great day.